Welcome to this MedTech Insight webinar on the theme of key EU and US IVD regulatory changes on the horizon. My name is Ashley Yo, and I'll be asking our in-house EU and US regulatory experts Amanda Maxwell and Dave Fillmore about the themes of the moment that are preoccupying the IVDs industry. We aim to highlight recent changes in regulation in these two key markets, talk about their consequences, flag up areas where there is concern or a perceived need for action, and perhaps gauge the sentiment of the US and EU diagnostic market players seen through the eyes of our experts. In referring to diagnostics today, we mean clinical chemistry, immunoassays, microbiology, CDX, and hematology testing in vitro, not in vivo or ex vivo testing. In a moment, Dave and Amanda will each give slide presentations on key themes and changes on the horizon in the US and EU markets, and then we'll have a debate around some of the points they raise. First, to say that IVDs get a relatively small share of national healthcare budgets, just 2 to 3% in many major markets, and much lower than amounts allocated to devices and pharma. They're often erroneously perceived by those not familiar with the industry as cheap and a part of the healthcare system where costs can be cut. Getting an innovative IVD test funded or added to a reimbursable list is frequently a long-winded affair, and yet it is also claimed that 60 to 70% of clinical decisions are based on the findings of these very tests. These disconnects and systemic underfunding are causes of great frustration to IVD players large and small. And before any of that comes a regulatory process, which in the EU is set to become even tougher with the forthcoming EU IVD regulation. This introduces a whole set of costly new regulatory changes. And in the US, a standalone IVD regulation does not exist, but compliance with a piecemeal set of rulemakings and guidances is likely to be just as onerous for companies. Happily, there is a vibrant ecosystem of IVDs and manufacturers who, it seems, can work around these difficulties, although as some ask, for how long can these pressures really be sustained? First to Amanda, who will give us a current update on the EU IVDR, and then Dave will profile the key points of the US IVD's regulatory system and changes that will or could be made there, and then we'll have a Q&A. So welcome to Amanda, who will now present her slides.
Hi, Ashley. Today I will be speaking about the EU's IVD regulation, the new regulation, and giving you some updates and explaining the implications for industry. Moving forwards on the slides to our first slide explaining the regulations. The current EU regulatory structure for IVDs is characterised by the IVD Medical Devices Directive. This is a 37-page document, and we are on the point of seeing a new IVD regulation, which in contrast is 477 pages long. So as you can see, things are going to be changing dramatically in the EU. There is going to be a 5-year transition period once the new IVD regulation has been adopted, and we're expecting it to be adopted before the end of the first half of this year. The IVD regulation follows the same basic structure as the EU's new medical devices regulation, but there will be a 5-year transition period for the IVD regulation in contrast with the 3-year transition period for the medical devices regulation. We're talking now about a regulation rather than a directive, and the difference is that directives are transposed into national law, and that allows countries to introduce their own national characteristics, shall we say, within those directives. But that won't happen with the regulations. They have to be adopted directly into national laws. And before I go any further, I'd just like to mention that the term device is used for IVDs within the IVD regulation. So quite frequently, if you hear the term device, it actually means an IVD, a diagnostic. So moving to the next slide, we're looking here at dates for your diary. The IVD text is due to be adopted by the European Parliament next week on April the 4th, and then following the various stages, we actually expect it to enter into force in the European Economic Area in mid-May to early June. So things are really on the cusp of changing. But that doesn't mean as companies that you'll be able to comply immediately. There's going to be this 5-year transition period. During that time, the notified bodies, the third-party designation bodies, will be applying to be designated against this new text. And they can start to apply 6 months after the text takes effect. So they can apply by the end of this year, we expect. But the actual process of designation under these new regulations is likely to take 12 to 18 months. So it will be some time before companies are actually able to claim compliance with the new regulations. And as I said, the regulations are going to fully apply in 5 years after they've taken effect. So we're talking about mid-2022. Moving to the next slide, I'd like to point out that in the EU there are going to be some really big changes for IVDs. Certainly the medical devices regulation is a big step up from the current medical device and active implantable medical device regulations. But the new IVD regulation is really a whole step change compared to the IVD directive. To start with, there's going to be a new system of classification. Products are going to be classified from A to D. A will be the lowest risk of them and D the highest risk. And under the directive, there was a list of products which were subject, in fact there were 2 lists of products that are subject to the highest requirements. And under the future regulations, there's going to be a set of rules that companies will have to apply for themselves to work out exactly which of the classifications apply and therefore which of the conformity assessment rules apply. And there is a new set of conformity assessment rules, quite detailed and complex, but essentially in future, under these new regulations, notified bodies will need to be involved with approximately 80 to 90% of IVDs. And this is a huge change from nowadays where they are involved under the directives in only about 10 to 15% of products. As mentioned before, there's going to be a 5-year transition period, but there is going to be much more pressure than that sounds. 5 years sounds a long time, but because the new medical devices regulation will be going through at the same time, there's going to be enormous pressure on all stakeholders in the system, and particularly the notified bodies, who I'll come to later. There's going to be new requirements for clinical evidence, and this will be for the first time for the vast majority of products. And this is going to be quite onerous for companies, and it'll apply for products that have been on the market already and that are being brought into compliance with the new regulations, as well as for new products. There are also going to be new rules for companion diagnostics and additional hoops for higher risk products. Turning now to the classification that I was mentioning, the fact that products will be classified from A to D. This EU system that we're going to have under the regulations is based on the system that was created by the former Global Harmonisation Task Force. That's now been replaced by the IMDRF, but the task force during its time created this system whereby the level of risk dictates the level of stringency of compliance of the products. So as you'll see here, where there is a low risk level to the patient and to the public, you will find products such as clinical chemistry analyzers. And at the other end of the scale, where there's a high risk to the patient and a high risk to the public, you'll find tests like HIV blood testing and HIV blood donor blood screening. And application of the classification rules will be governed by the intended purpose of the devices or the IVDs. And if several classification rules apply to the same device, then the rule resulting in the higher classification will apply. Moving to the next slide, you'll see the 7 rules that replace the list-based classification for the higher risk IVDs under the directives. There are 7 essential rules, but they are quite detailed within them, particularly Rule 3, which contains a very long list of products that fall into that rule. And it's very interesting to see that cancer tests, for instance, and companion diagnostics will be in that rule. And cancer tests actually came under the general listing, or still do come under the general listing under the current IVD directive. So the requirements for cancer tests in particular are going to be significantly tighter and more challenging for companies. So all of these products will fall into Class C, the third highest of the classes. I'd also like to draw attention to Rule 5, which is Class A, and just at the top there, it shows you the products that are going to fall into that Class A, and there aren't many at all, just instruments, specimen receptacles, and general lab products, really the very simplest of the products. Self-tests and near-patient tests in Rule 4, well, those may fall into Class B or C, but that's for the self-test, but it depends on really the perceived risk for those products, and near-patient tests will be classified in their own right. Moving now to the next slide, I mentioned earlier that the notified bodies will be involved in conformity assessment for the vast majority of IVDs in the products in the future. And that is with the exception of the Class A products, where I was pointing out in the previous slide that there won't be that many products in that any longer. But even within Class A, if there are sterility elements or the products intended for self-testing or near-patient testing, there will have to be a notified body involved. And then when it comes to products in the new Class B, C and D, a notified body will be involved in all 3 classes, with the level of involvement and scrutiny rising with the risk class of the IVDs. The conformity assessment for Class B and C devices did need some further clarification, especially when it comes to technical file sampling. So that's something to look out for when it comes to the final version of the new IVD regulation. The next slide focuses on notified body capacity issues. This is a key issue that all IVD manufacturers must be aware of. It will be important for you to assess whether your notified body is going to survive in the future. As I mentioned, some 80 to 90% of products are going to need the involvement of a notified body compared to 10 to 15% now. So you can imagine the potential bottlenecks that are going to occur, not least because medical devices are also having to go through the new system, and many of the notified bodies that are IVD notified bodies also are medical device notified bodies, and the same operations are carried out by the same people within those organisations. So there is going to be a very severe capacity issue unless a huge number of people are taken on by these organisations, or there are a lot more notified bodies set up. So it's important to find out who the current notified bodies are for IVDs. There are only 22 of them at the moment, compared to more like 60 for medical devices. And even if a notified body is currently working under the IVD directive, you need to find out if they're going to also want to continue under the much stricter, more demanding circumstances under the IVD regulation. Look at their likely capacity. Look at how soon they're likely to be designated. Are they likely to be one of the front runners? What sort of staff do they have, and do they really have the clinical expertise that's going to be demanded under the new regulations? Also, look out for how they perform unannounced audits and how frequently, and whether they're in compliance in that area. I've heard it said that the notified body IVD workload is likely to be 8 times what it is today. So it's going to be a tough environment. The next slide deals with companion diagnostics. These are going to be regulated for the first time. And basically, a companion diagnostic is a product that looks at those patients that are most likely to benefit or who are most at risk from the companion medicinal product which it's testing the patients against. The description there is the description as it is in the regulation, and companion diagnostics will fall into Class C under the new regulation. And for these particular products, the notified body will have to consult a drug competent authority or the European Medicines Agency, depending which is the relevant one under the drug rules for the drug that's been tested against. The next slide, we look at in-house manufacturer exemptions and how there are different rules for products that are manufactured in-house within the same health institution compared to products that are placed on the market. And essentially, these products are exempt from the IVDR, but they have to comply with general safety and performance requirements. The exception is for Class D IVDs, where the health institution must assemble documentation enabling the competent authority to check the general safety and performance requirements. And this provision can also be extended by member states to classes A, B and C. But it is still an exemption from the much stricter rules that are laid down in the regulation. It's just Class D has a higher level of demonstrating that it meets those requirements than the other classes. And this slide also lays down the additional requirements that need to be met in that area. Turning now to the scrutiny of high-risk devices, just as under the Medical Devices Regulation, under the IVD regulation, there's going to be a special scrutiny procedure for the higher-risk IVD devices, those in Class D. There are also detailed performance evaluation requirements for these products. There is a new structure, the Medical Devices Coordination Group, which will have the opportunity to scrutinise the assessment of Class D IVDs conducted by notified bodies, along with the European Commission. And they may request scientific advice from new expert panels relating to the safety and performance of the IVD device. Turning now to the next slide, This looks at newcomers in the governance structure, and one of them is indeed this Medical Devices Coordination Group, which will support the European Commission with implementation issues and can create subgroups to provide in-depth expertise. And this group will replace the Medical Devices Expert Group that we have under the directives. There's also the Joint Research Council, which is involved in submitting applications for reference laboratory designation, which we'll come to, and also will provide technical support for the other newcomers, the reference laboratories and the expert panels. The reference laboratories will give scientific opinions on Class D IVDs, as well as potentially certain Class C IVDs, and they'll carry out lab tests and assess IVD compliance. The expert panels, meanwhile, will be created on a standing or temporary basis by the Commission, and they'll provide scientific advice in general and clinical support to the Commission, to the MDCG, to industry and notified bodies, and there are a lot of details in the regulations about exactly how that will work. On the next slide, we are looking at clinical evidence, which is required for the first time for the vast majority of IVDs. The need for this is to demonstrate compliance with the relevant general safety and performance requirements. And within this, there are many new terms and requirements. For example, performance evaluation and performance studies. It's a big mind shift for the IVD industry, and it's going to be costly to gather the evidence together. And it's going to also, there are going to be questions about how to manage transitioning products that are already on the market, how to gather that evidence together, and how to present it. And coming to the final slide, this is a list of further issues to consider. The scope and designation period is a particularly important issue to consider. There are a lot of detailed requirements surrounding the transition period in the text of the IVD regulation. They contain a lot of links to other parts of the regulation, and they're particularly difficult to follow. So that's one of the things that we will be trying in MedTech Insight to make clearer for you, as we have done with the Medical Devices Regulation. There's also a series of delegated and implementing acts that are awaited, and these are going to provide a great deal of additional detail over and above the many pages that are already in this regulation. So even when you've read the regulation, that won't be it. There's a lot more to come. There's also guidance to come, and there will be standards and updated standards. And I'll leave you to read the remaining issues that are listed there and that are worth keeping an eye out for when you're reading MedTech Insight.
Thanks very much, Amanda. That very detailed presentation. I just wanted to ask you there, is it fair to say that the IVD regulation is the biggest single event for the EU diagnostics industry since regulation began?
Yes, Ashley, yes, it certainly is the first big overhaul of IVD regulations in the EU since the regulations began. And the changes are going to be challenging, and they're going to be very costly to adapt to.
And certainly a lot of work if you're speaking of 8 times the workload.
Exactly.
Thanks very much. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And now welcome also to Dave, who's going to tell us what is changing around IVD's regulation in the US. Hello, Dave.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you. And thanks, Amanda, for that look forward on what's to come here in the EU. A lot, obviously, to look out for in the coming years. On the U.S. side, there's not the same across-the-board reform happening right now as there is with the IVD regulation in the EU, but there are important changes that are in the works, and there are more potential reforms on the table that could really have some significant implications for the space. So what I'll do today is I'm going to as we go to my first slide, set the scene on sort of the U.S. regulatory space, particularly touching on some fundamentals for the IVD regulatory landscape. Then get into a focus on reforms that are, changes that are in the works, and then, what might be next from both Congress and U.S. FDA. So first of all, in terms of setting the scene here for the U.S. reg environment, I think from industry's perspective, at least from the IVD test kit manufacturers space, the perception is FDA is heading in the right direction in supporting innovation. Policies have been implemented in recent years to improve transparency and speed. Certainly it's not perfect. Certainly improvements are sought. In particular, stakeholders that would be more considered laboratories rather than manufacturers have been less happy about some discussions in recent years. But even for that group, the direction seems to be heading in the positive direction. Key part of the scene, of course, in the U.S. is the Trump administration in the House. There's some, and some maybe a little bit of an understatement, uncertainty, some chaos at points coming out in terms of the type of policies to expect on various fronts from the current administration. But one of the key decisions so far with regards to the FDA is basically the nomination of a new commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, to head the FDA, and that's actually expected to bring some sense of normalcy, stability, as he's a known quantity. Another key point in the reg environment is the MDUFA 4 user fee agreement. So user fees need to be reauthorized every 5 years in the U.S., and the current one is about to expire in September. So there's a new agreement that is before Congress now. It would include extra fees for industry, but new commitments from FDA to improve the review process and new investments. So that's a key priority and one that will have implications for the IVD space for sure. Final point I wanted to make here was just, the diagnostic regulatory space in the U.S. is fragmented. There are really different systems for two stakeholder groups, essentially, the IVD test kit manufacturers and companies and or labs that produce lab-developed test services. So that's what, sort of a key dynamic impacting reforms and discussions in the area. There's also different challenges for point-of-care or near testing systems. So I will, first of all, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but just that talking about regulatory fragmentation, that responds to, a diversity in the lab diagnostic market in terms of technologies, from more advanced technologies to more established, different user environments, sophisticated laboratories, everything, and going down to, at-home patient testing by patients, which is happening. And this all overlaps with different business models, as I've alluded to. So with getting just a few basics, so it's somewhat of a distinction, I guess, with the EU system is that FDA regulates IVDs as medical devices. There is no distinct regulatory structure for IVDs. It falls as one category under the overall device framework that FDA oversees. It's a risk-based system. Of course, as the risk goes up, the requirements increase, including the pre-market review requirements. Everything from low risk, no 510K, no review to 510Ks and de novos to the most data-heavy PMAs. Those numbers on the right of the slide are just to point out that, IVDs make up an important part of the focus and the workload for FDA device reviewers on all the different regulatory pathways, PMAs, 510Ks, and de novos, which are an increasingly used pathway for novel, moderate risk devices, and IVDs in particular. There's also, a sizable chunk of diagnostics that don't require FDA review because perhaps the risk level is low enough where they're exempt from 510Ks, and that list of exemptions I think will be increasing, which I'll point out in an upcoming slide. As well as, these lab-developed tests, which I mentioned, which are regulated under a different system that, rather than the FDA Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment statute, which is primarily overseen by the CMS, the Medicare agency. So just as I said, IVDs are regulated as devices, but there are some key distinctions to point out that are specific to this group, particularly one, the CLIA classification. So there's another element of this CLIA system in which FDA has to designate a status for all diagnostics, either as waived, moderately complex, or highly complex. This is crucial to sort of the settings in which a test can be used in the market. And particularly this waived status is important for any company wishing to sell in the sort of point-of-care near testing market, which is growing, and that requires some extra data. There's also there's a separate office within the FDA Device Center that looks at diagnostics. IVDs as well as imaging tools. So it's different personnel looking at these, and at least one assessment has shown that there's actually more communication during the review process, and on average the decision times are quicker with this diagnostics office, OIR as it's abbreviated, compared to the Office of Device Evaluation, which is reviews all other device types. And then just to point out here, the consistent standards from FDA standpoint for IVDs is analytical and clinical validity. So now I will be getting over to the, reform focus, as I said, areas where changes are happening or perhaps bigger changes are in the works. So topics I'll touch on here are CLIA waivers, next generation sequencing, lab-developed tests, and how debates around that could evolve into broader reforms for diagnostics in the U.S., and then talk about the FDA environment. So switching here, I'm talk first about CLIA waiver reforms. As I mentioned, this is tied to the point of care market. Basically, selling companies as the growing market selling for use for testing at the hospital bedside, at clinics, patient clinics, at doctors' offices, basically other settings that are not highly sophisticated, more controlled clinical laboratory environments. These are typically referred to as certificate of waiver labs. They make up a big proportion of potential customer base in the U.S., a very growing market and growing to different types of tests and assays. So this is an important area, but it does require some extra work on the company's part. In addition to any approval or clearance one would get for your assay, you would also need to achieve this CLIA waiver status to be able to sell to these types of labs and users. That means proving your test is basically simple and really dummy-proof to avoid errors, minimize errors in these settings. But in recent years, the industry has said it's been too hard to prove that standard, but changes are coming. So the 21st Century Cures Act, which was enacted into law late last year, includes a provision that would directs FDA to move away from the sort of gold standard accuracy benchmark for CLIA waiver. So instead of having to compare your test against some gold standard assay to reach this threshold, you would instead be able to compare the results of your test in the waive setting versus the results of that same test in a more sophisticated, complex setting to show similar results. So that could be a key change that could increase CLIA waivers going forward. Also, in the user fee agreement I mentioned, the reauthorization that's before Congress, there's some additional goals for more efficient reviews for the CLIA waivers and more enhancements to the process itself. Next, I will switch to tests that are intended to be very simple to ones that are typically much more complex, particularly next-generation sequencing. It's been a very strong focus of FDA in particular. There's been a lot of discussion around coming up with a new regulatory paradigm for this category of diagnostic technology that's rapidly evolving and brings up a lot of different issues than standard type of assays. So FDA has been emphasizing the idea of really relying on standards and relying on shared databases, shared tools between researchers and developers to expedite how new NGS-related tests and systems can be brought to market, perhaps by avoiding the need to collect and submit new clinical data for each new marker, each new assay by using these tools. This is still in the works. It's a process in the work that's not established yet. There's 2 draft guidance documents sort of laying out FDA's plan on these standards and shared databases approach. FDA has also put out some tools, particularly this Precision FDA database, as a way to start the process of really emphasizing sharing of data, sharing of linkages between genes and clinical outcomes. So this is something that really has been put a priority on, and there's no reason to believe that won't continue. For the Precision Medicine Initiative started by the Obama administration has supported this, and there's been some new funding for that recently. So it's something to look out for. Next, I was going to switch to the LDT debate. So I've mentioned lab-developed tests a few times, and this is sort of, I think, is similar to when in the European part that Amanda was talking about, the Inhouse tests that she was referring to. There's a lot of discussion in the U.S. about this issue. Basically, LDTs are, defined as tests that are developed and formed by the same lab and, then offered as they're performed as a clinical service rather than a packaged product. This could be certainly, tests developed by hospital labs, but also there's a lot of growing activity in companies, that set up as CLIA certified labs to offer, for instance, an advanced diagnostic service or, complex genomic assays, et cetera. So FDA has taken a hands-off approach of these offerings for the past number of decades. They say it's basically has been an enforcement discretion policy they've decided because the risk didn't warrant their involvement. Others have argued there's a lack of authority there. But regardless, FDA has really said in recent years they feel like they do need to step in to deal with the sort of growing development of advanced diagnostics as lab-developed tests. So in 2014, they issued a proposal for a phased-in sort of risk-based transition to kind of a device-type oversight for at least a subset of LDTs. That was scheduled to be finalized by the end of last year, but pretty much at the 11th hour. More specifically, after the November elections in the U.S., FDA elected to not go ahead with finalizing that plan, and sort of its status is in doubt. Essentially, I think that had to do with determining that the surprise victory by Donald Trump would sort of switch direction in policy at FDA towards a more anti-regulation approach, and so not wanting to sort of implement something that's likely to be reversed in the near term. There was a discussion paper released by FDA in the closing days of the Obama administration, providing some sort of recommendations for how path forward based on comments they had received. And what really that did, in addition to a few other events, is really push the ball potentially to Congress to address this issue. And this really has implications not just for LDTs, but both IVD kits and LDTs, as parties are pushing Congress potentially to create a system that establishes a more level playing field between those two categories. So if you have an assay, test a certain analyte, if it's the same, they should, whether it's a kit or a service, it should be subject to the same standards, some argue. So speaking of Congress, I will touch on sort of what's going on there, what are some key recent and forward-looking events. So the 21st Century Cures Act is something I've mentioned, and the CLIA waiver provisions I've touched on. There's also some provisions in there to really push FDA to consider more exemptions from the 510K system, 510K reviews. There was recently a listing of, hundreds of device types that are proposed for exemption under that requirement, and many were actually IVDs. So that could have some important implications for streamlining the path to market. There's also breakthrough device pathway there, some provision for easier recognition of standards by FDA, and more funding for that precision medicine initiative I mentioned. The discussion paper I've already mentioned, just more impetus for congressional reform. And then very recently, in the past week or two, there's been actually a draft legislation circulated in the U.S. House of Representatives, and something that's been talked about on the Senate side before as well, that would create a new paradigm for diagnostic regulation, a new category called in vitro clinical tests. So what this proposal would do is essentially create a new category, as I said, combining IVDs and LDTs into one thing that is distinct from medical devices from the standpoint of government oversight. This is being circulated in a sort of bipartisan way, in the sense Republican and Democrats are the sort of sponsors. It is something that has been talked about previously, and actually comes from a proposal from a few years ago from a collaborative group of IVD manufacturers and labs, clinical labs, that kind of came up with this proposal. So basically it would be kind of a risk-based approach that mirrors the device system in some way, but would really more specifically target itself in various ways at diagnostic rather than therapeutic interventional products. It really also puts an emphasis on splitting the authorities between FDA and CMS with an eye towards distinguishing the practices of manufacturing tests versus laboratory operations conducting tests. But it has a new approaches to classification data requirements. Also gets rid of the concept completely of predicate devices substantial equivalence. that really underlies device 510Ks. So it would be a paradigm change, really, for diagnostics if something like this were to go through. So the question is interesting of the timing right now. We have this user fee authorization bill that I've just talked about. It's a must-pass bill, so sometimes it's a target for other things to be added onto it. So can this hitch a ride is the question. That, it's something that will have to be watched out for in the next few months. Really, the user fee bill needs to be passed by July. Otherwise, layoff notices start going to FDA staffers. So that's kind of seen as an important deadline. As I said, it's a possible legislative vehicle for the IVCT proposal, but we really don't know yet. Sponsors won't talk about timing. They're collecting feedback from stakeholders. But it really, could be pushed along by the fact that, as I said, groups including AdvaMed are pushing for action to create more of a level playing field for IVDs and LDTs, and this would be one thing that could do that. I won't spend time on this, but I also included on this slide some highlights of the core user fee agreement that would be included in this user fee bill, the CLIA waivers, some new performance goals, more investments. But for now, we'll move on. And lastly, I was going to talk about, the new FDA leadership, as I mentioned. Scott Gottlieb has been nominated to run FDA. That's the most specific, other than some stray comments by the president about overregulation by FDA for life science products. This is really the specific FDA policy or decision that's been made so far is the nomination of Scott Gottlieb. So that was seen as good news by industry. He's a known quantity. He was the deputy commissioner of the agency during the George W. Bush administration. He is expected to continue or accelerate any moves towards cutting down on regulatory burdens where possible. While he's very familiar with all aspects of FDA regulation, not just drugs, but diagnostics, devices, and IT as well. And he's, generally has a stance of being, pushing against regulation in various areas, including he's been on record as being opposed to FDA oversight of LDTs. So he's seen as an important point person, I think, at getting user fees done, getting some other industry priorities done. The big but here is that he's not in the position right now. He needs to be confirmed by the Senate, and the timing on that still remains to be seen. So that will be an important thing to look out for. But for now, I think I will pass back off to Ashley to see if he has any discussion points for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. A lot of information in there, a lot of insight, and indeed, thanks for both presentations showing just how tightly regulated this sector is. I wanted to ask, is there a case, as some would see it, in the area of lab-developed tests, in-house manufactured tests, for even stronger regulation given the significant level of their use, which are referring back to your slide 10 and the comments that Amanda made. Dave, could I ask you that first?
Sure. I mean, and I think I alluded to this a bit, is, the argument from the IVD industry, the Roches and et cetera, represented by AdvaMed in the U.S. at least, is, there's a long-held feeling that, if you have a test that tests analyte X or multiplex analyte X through 10 or whatever, if it's the same thing, it should, they think there should be basically the same standards of whether it's a packaged product or selling a service out of a laboratory. That's not the case right now. It's definitely a goal, though, to make that happen of the IVD industry. On the other side of the question, labs say, look, lab operations, including creating tests, are not the same thing as product manufacturing. They need to be considered differently, and that there already high standards exist in the U.S. They point out, they say federal CLIA requirements, which are mostly about lab operation oversight, not specific tests, but nonetheless, those plus some state requirements in the U.S. are, already require high standards. But I think there's an expectation for something here to happen on the U.S. side.
Thanks, Dave. And Amanda, is there the same pressure of feeling in the EU on this matter, do you think?
Well, certainly some may see in-house manufacture as unfair competition, given that it will only be partially regulated in the EU under the new regulations. And for those who have to go through all the hoops to place their products on the market under the future regulations with all the complexity, I can imagine that there could be some pressure to change things for in-house manufacture, but it's taken years to get these regulations through, so I very much doubt things are likely to change for quite some time. And the regulations seem more focused on the direct safety issue rather than the trade issues in this respect, in that there's tighter regulation for the Class D devices than for less risky devices. But certainly some may feel the requirements are far from what is required to normally demonstrate safety for all the other IVDs placed on the market.
Thank you, Amanda. And a question on the effect on innovation, sort of the other side of the coin. Is the way IVDs are regulated in both of these markets, would you say holding back or helping innovation to develop? Might come to Dave again first there, please.
Well, it's on the U.S. end. I mean, it's certainly not a perfect system, and there are complaints. But overall, the direction of reform in the U.S. really, as I said, is kind of supporting innovation in diagnostics. And some concerns that have been addressed are, I think, being tried to be responded to by the concerns about regulators' ability to adapt to quickly evolving technologies, particularly next-gen sequencing. That's something that FDA has been really trying to focus on and come up with other approaches, as I mentioned. CLIA waivers was another big area of complaint, a lot of discussion, feeling that it just wasn't, there's been, slowing up the point of care market because of some inappropriate requirements, and that's something that's being worked on. And then, as I mentioned, there's this draft legislation for the IVCTs. The bill is actually called the Diagnostic Accuracy and Innovation Act. That could be another thing. So we'll have to wait and see if that has legs. But, I think overall it's going in the right direction would be the perception, even though there, of course, challenges remain.
Well, that sounds positive. And maybe I could ask Amanda, is IVD regulation in the EU, is it seen as innovation friendly, would you say?
Well, it seems that while the US is becoming potentially more open to innovation, the EU regulations are likely to go in the opposite direction and actually become an obstacle to innovation. There's much tighter regulation, especially for the Class B, C and D products. So that's basically the vast majority of tests. There's third-party involvement, the costs of that, the costs of clinical evidence, the time it's going to take to get to market. All of that is likely to put off smaller manufacturers or those with less experience, and it's often the smaller manufacturers that are the ones that are trying to innovate. I suppose there's also the argument that by jumping through so many hoops and being subject to so much extra scrutiny or having to comply with the new common specifications that are going to be out there, that might inspire more confidence and a faster uptake of products once they actually get onto the market. That's among the higher risk IVDs. But everything is going to be very costly, and the movement, I think, is for the EU to become a less innovation-friendly market.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask then, Dave, coming to the fragmented regulatory space in the US, as you mentioned in your slides, could you unpack that just a little bit? Reforms are coming, but is that seen as a drawback by companies in the States?
Well, yeah, it depends who you talk to. I think developers of lab-developed tests, which include labs, but also really more companies that have just used that pathway as a way to market for advanced systems. I've seen the current CLIA system as a positive, and they're worried about changes in there. So, I think that's the primary cause of fragmentation. And in addition to, that sort of point of care issue. Overall, some say there's good reason for it. Some really want to push for a more cohesive approach that also is flexible to allow for development of different types of tests, more advanced, evolving products. So, I think that's the rationale for a lot of reform that's being talked about is, trying to come up with more cohesive approach, but that to the overall sort of diagnostics in the U.S., but one that is flexible enough to address all the sort of diversity in the system.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Dave. A question to Amanda. The FDA-centered system, obviously different to the EU system, the single system with decentralized system using notified bodies. Is there, would you say, any evidence that companies in the EU prefer this kind of system that they've got? You talked about a step change in your slides. Will they still feel the same after the directive becomes the regulation?
Well, it's not really a question of whether they prefer a decentralised system, Ashley. It's just that that's how the system is. The original medical device directives, including the IVD directive, brought together diverging rules, or indeed lack of rules, among the different countries and cultures of the EU. But many aspects relating to the use of IVDs in Europe remain governed by national law, for example, the funding and reimbursement in particular. So we need to remember that the EU remains decentralised by its very nature, and that there are also different language barriers and different medical and prescribing practices within the different cultures. Sometimes companies choose to or have to go to notified bodies in different countries, and this can create language challenges, not only for communication but also for documentation for IVDs. So the system will remain both united and fragmented in the same way after the IVD directive is overtaken by the IVD regulation. But it's worth repeating that the IVD directive was transposed into national law, which means the national differences could be introduced to reflect specific national laws, whereas the IVD regulation has to be implemented directly into the national laws of the EEE member states. That's into the laws of 33 countries in total, and that's without changes.
Well, that's interesting. And we go further into these two grandstand issues that potentially override all others for the IVDs industry, as well as others. Donald Trump's presidency and what that might mean for businesses in the US and the EU IVDR. So if we come on to Trump in just a few minutes, but first I'm going to come back to Amanda then on the IVDR and the changes in the cost of doing business. There's obviously risks inherent in the changes. But could you drill down on some of the major elements that are likely to face companies where they're going to be facing larger costs, bigger burdens, and might we reach a stage where this situation might be as onerous to stop a company or a product actually coming onto the market? Right.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, Ashley. The aim has not been to add cost and complexity, but it's certainly been the result. And when you consider the size and profitability of the many small and medium enterprises in this sector, your question, which companies are going to manage to upgrade their regulatory systems, is valid. They need the resources to meet the stricter requirements in terms of conformity assessment, involvement of notified bodies, and clinical evidence, both for existing products and for new ones. And it's a big ask, and there's a serious question over the ability for many to survive. Even getting to grips with the monster-sized regulation will most likely be enough to put those companies operating out of a garage, for example, out of business.
Well, that is a worry. But you've spoken about notified bodies. I think you said 22, quite a small number already, with a higher workload and lots of companies at their door. That's obviously going to be a capacity risk as well.
It certainly is. It's a huge capacity risk, and as I mentioned before, the IVD regulation is going to be coming into effect at the same time as the medical devices regulation, so it's going to be very challenging for the notified bodies to find capacity to deal with both of them.
Do you think we're going to have will there be any further substantive changes to the text of the IVD regulation now, or are we at the final point?
Really, we're just about at the final point. The IVD regulation is likely to be finally adopted by the European Parliament next week. It'll then be published the end of April, early May, and we're not expecting any further substantive changes compared with the February the 22nd version that we've already seen. And even that one contains no huge surprises compared with the version published last June. I should add that there's also been a March the 7th version, although I haven't looked at that in detail, but to my knowledge there aren't any big surprises in that one either.
Thank you. And I think in your final slide you mentioned Delegated Acts in a list of other things to look out for, and these are substantially a great unknown, I think. Do we know anything of the content or the timing of when they're going to appear and when manufacturers will be affected?
Well, the content of the 80 delegated and implementing acts that we're expecting across both the IVD and the medical devices regulation is an unknown. But we know that the Commission considers 18 of them mandatory. And what exactly they mean by that, by mandatory, that's a key question, and I'm waiting to hear back from the Commission on that right now. But there has been a certain amount of criticism from the industry that actually there's not the same kind of detail in the IVD regulation as there is in the medical devices regulation, and I'm not sure that this additional detail will have to come through the delegated and implementing acts, but it's just worth throwing in here that some kind of balancing may be needed, but I'm not quite sure how they will do that.
Okay. And I'd also like to ask, we couldn't do a webinar on EU regulation on this day of days in the UK and EU, especially with Article 50 being invoked, the step that takes the UK further out of the European Union. We know very little about what will happen to the industry, the IVD's industry, 9 months after the referendum vote. But have you a sense of how companies are preparing for what might lie ahead?
When it comes to preparing for Brexit, I think a lot of companies still have their head in the sand, or at the very best, they're relying on the industry associations to find a way forward for them. And I think we've all been probably in shock about what's happening and what the implications are going to be. We've never been through anything like this before, so I think it's quite a difficult thing to prepare for. The most critical element of this for the IVD sector is going to surround UK notified bodies and the authorised representatives who represent manufacturers from third countries. Because we don't know about their ability to continue operations in the UK and whether they'll still be recognised, whether they'll move abroad, what exactly will happen. And there are already too few notified bodies in the IVD space, just 22. Without the UK notified bodies practising in this area, that number of 22 will reduce further. And this would put even more stress on an already potentially compromised system. So I just can't imagine that the UK notified body operations will cease altogether, but they may change, the location of where they're being carried out may change. There are still a lot of unknowns.
Yes, potentially a concern. Thank you for those comments on the IVDR, Amanda. If we can now just turn to focus on the US again and to Donald Trump. Dave, a very, very big general question, given that the American Health Care Act was pulled just last Friday. Do we have any insight on what changes, in spite of that, what changes for lab diagnostics might lie in store in the US in the near and more distant future? Anything that we can mention?
Well, yeah, it remains to be seen. There's several ways of probably looking at this. In a way, the election of Trump already had one direct impact in diagnostics, as I sort of alluded to in the slide. I think FDA sort of reversed its plans to finalize its lab-developed test framework specifically as a result of the election. So that's kind of, I don't think that would have happened if Clinton had won, and that's kind of pushed the envelope to Congress to maybe do some more reforms. So there's one sort of impact already. I think the primary decision so far, as I mentioned, from the Trump administration in terms of FDA policy has been, the nomination of Scott Gottlieb. So far, that's been a positive. That's a positive for industry. He's a known quantity, and he's not someone, compared to some of the alternatives that have been discussed, who's going to completely explode the system, but he's going to push towards reducing burdens. So really, the medtech industry's primary top-line goals are 21st Century Cures Act implementation, and working to get the user fee reauthorized, user fee system reauthorized. Gottlieb's going to be a positive on both, but the question is, will there be other complications coming from the administration that, get in the way of this? So you mentioned the AHCA, the Republican health reform package that was designed to repeal and replace Obamacare. It's now crashed and burned. So actually the fact that that sort of hyper-partisan bill is off the table at the moment could actually help with user fee reauthorization in a way. It removes one distraction from the healthcare committees, which we're getting certainly very, very, at each other's throat with regards to that healthcare reform bill. Maybe they can now focus on the user fee process a little bit more, which tends to be a little bit more bipartisan based on, historical precedent. But the other potential shadow over this is the Trump administration's budget blueprint. A few weeks ago, sort of a budget request came from the administration that had a lot of deep cuts in domestic policy, including for FDA, and it included a request for a big increase in industry user fees to take the place of government funds. That would be a lot more than industry had agreed to. So, there's nothing binding about that proposal, but if it started to insert itself at all, get any sway in Congress, it could complicate or delay discussions on the Hill with related to the user fee plan, because, if it ended up having to push towards any sort of renegotiation, that would be a big complication for industry and for FDA. So, we'll have to basically see where this goes.
Yeah, so that's potential negative, but at least Gottlieb might represent some hope on the horizon for some positive change. And could I also ask you, Dave, FDA is a leader in regulatory thinking, and both the agency and the Congress are pushing forward in terms of regulation. You mentioned in your slides next generation sequencing. Would you say that the US is ahead of the EU in this aspect of regulation?
Well, I don't have an in-depth on where the EU is on addressing that item in particular. For sure, it's been a key focus at FDA. It's something they've put, at the forefront as a topic of discussion. Had many meetings on the topic of next generation sequencing. Gotten attention during when President Obama was in the White House. A lot of discussion with regards to his precision medicine initiative. So it's something that is really considered a key priority in terms of coming up with a new approach, trying to be a little bit more agile in regulations. So yeah, I would say FDA is trying to put its best foot forward on that.
Thanks, Dave. And could you just a final question on this sort of theme? Could you give a sort of comment on the potential value of what might be contained in the Diagnostic Accuracy and Innovation Act, and also recap briefly on the potential value of for IVDs in the 21st Century Cures Act?
Yeah, so with regards to the proposal, the IVCT, the diagnostic draft bill, we really have to see where that goes. First of all, I wouldn't want to commit to that actually being a reality this year. It's just just something to watch. Could be more time. It could get way late. But yeah, it's certainly, the goal is to for IVDs, the goal would certainly streamline the regulatory process various ways in terms of the time FDA would be expected to review, the types of considerations they would do. They'd probably push more IVDs into lower risk categories just based on how it defines how to consider risk. So it would really be designed to streamline process. Of course, there's always potential for unintended consequences. It's actually a very complex proposal. So I think that's something that would really need to be watched. In terms of 21st Century Cures, I mentioned the CLIA waiver reforms in the slides. The breakthrough pathway, sort of the headline provision with regards to medtech. So IVDs could benefit from that. It's really a pathway for expediting not just the review process at FDA, but the entire development process. Working closer with FDA on creating a study plan and getting through to market quicker for products that can be proved to really be meeting completely unmet needs for important diseases. So that's a key one. There are other things in there, even some focus on, for instance, testing for antimicrobial susceptibility, another diagnostic application. So there's a number of things to watch. It's an important bill, and FDA right now is implementing that. They've taken a few steps, but there's a lot more to go. So really focusing on what comes out from FDA on implementation will be the key thing.
Thank you, Dave. So to the final question from me, given the market sizes, the access hurdles that you talked about, and the support available, which would you say is the better launch market for IVDs for companies that are equally familiar with both markets, the US or the EU. And then also please add your roundup comments as you wish. Amanda, could I ask you first?
Well, yes, it's been very interesting hearing from Dave about the direction in which the US is going and becoming more innovation friendly at the same time that there's no doubt that the EU is going to be considerably tougher because of the new regulatory hurdles. And adapting to those hurdles within the 5-year time frame is going to be a tall order. There are so many new structures that need building, and the ability of the notified bodies to take on more capacity is absolutely crucial, and we don't know whether that's going to be possible. The EU is definitely going to be feeling its way. The medical devices regulation will be going first, so that might be an advantage in some ways for the IVD sector, but for IVD companies to find room to make the progress they need to make to comply with the new regulations, it's going to be a really tough period. And it depends for an IVD manufacturer whether as a company they want to be one of the first who are compliant with the new regulation and to enjoy the competitive advantages that would give, or whether they feel that their resources dictate they need to wait until the new way of working has settled into place and then make forays into the new system. There's going to be an awful lot to learn, an awful lot of new structures that are coming along, new delegated and implementing acts, new guidance. The list just doesn't stop. It's going to be a very busy 5 years.
Thank you. Complicated times ahead. Dave, what are your views on that?
Well, the one thing I would say, obviously obviously the key trend is that we are seeing, different directions in regulations in the U.S. and the EU. So, obviously Amanda's comments make a lot of sense and I think are worth heeding. The one thing I would say is, bringing it back to your original introduction, Ashley, and also something Amanda alluded to a little earlier, is, launch factors go beyond just regulation. Reimbursement is obviously crucial, market dynamics, competition, et cetera. So, the extent that regulatory changes, demands go up for more data, ends up putting an IVD in a better position to make its case before payers or customers, then, that could potentially have a positive impact in the future in terms of where, market dynamics for a test and where you'd want to launch it. But, overall, there's just a lot of changes on the table right now. In the EU, it's all laid out. A portion is laid out on paper here. We're waiting, I know, for those delegated and implementing acts. But, the implementation will really be crucial to understanding all the implications. And in the U.S., the things are going in the right direction, but there are a lot of things up in the air right now. So, we'll have to see what types of reforms actually take place and how those get implemented. So it'll be important to watch in the few years ahead here, I think. Very interesting times. But, I suspect it's always going to depend on, there's a lot of factors for each individual product, and I'm sure, that's going to remain the case over time, regardless of the reforms. Very good, very good.
So thank you very much to both Amanda Maxwell and Dave Fillmore from MedTech Insights editorial team for providing such illuminating comments on this theme in excellent presentations. For IVD's businesses, the regulatory world is in flux, and despite the vital nature of their products, they wait with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation to find out how they'll be affected by the far-reaching changes that our experts have expanded upon. My name is Ashley O, and I'm attached to the Informa Group's MedTech teams. If you wish to comment on the content of this webinar or suggest future themes, please email pharma@informa.com. Thank you and goodbye.